On the last part of our morning show today, we have a story. It's Rose's story, a survivor story, and Rose could not be here today, but Audrey is here. And Audrey, you've got the story. You were going to share it with us here on the final portion.
Yep. All right, this is word for word what she sent to me, so I will read it word for word. I have stayed at Ada James twice. The second stay is extremely more meaningful than the first, although the first day did help me get back on my feet after a difficult divorce and becoming a single mom of 2 boys. But between the first day and the second stay, there has been a lot of emotional things that took a turn for the worst. It all started back in 2023 when my estranged husband, my son, and I moved from Richland Center to Cottage Grove. Shortly after we moved to Cottage Grove, I noticed my son, who was then 7 to 8 years old, was getting in trouble at school with the apartment complex we lived in and eventually the local cops. I was working full-time at home. When I was at work, my estranged husband was responsible for my son. There were times when things were all good and quiet, but then came 2024. Things began to take a turn for the worst. I would constantly be getting interrupted at work, either by my spouse or my son. There was one day I got just finished working, and all of a sudden I heard screaming coming from right outside of my office door. I went out and saw my husband with his hand around my son's throat because he was being rude and talking back. I immediately got in between the two and asked what was going on. To my surprise, it was, of course, 2 different stories, but I was always taught to listen to both sides before making any decision. But I was also taught that you always have your child's back in the long run. So as I was taught, I listened to both sides and immediately went to talk to my husband. I explained to him and that no matter how frustrating my son makes him, he is never to lay a finger on my son again. Ever since I got on my husband for laying his hands on my son, things just weren't the same. Things felt off. I knew then we were drifting apart. I had began talking to someone else. Then it comes around to August, September 2024. This is when everything turns on to me. There had been around 3 days where my husband would cook dinner for when I got off work, and we would eat as a family, and it seemed like clockwork. That at 9 p.m. I would start getting extremely tired for no reason and pass out on our couch in the living room. There were 2 particular instances where I would wake up in the bedroom with him and not remember how I got there. The second particular instance, I remember very vaguely waking up and passing back out. This is the instance where I knew something wasn't right. I was in and out of consciousness. I remember waking up twice and asking what was going on, and his response was, "I'm having sex with my wife." And I had told him no, he had to stop, and then I would pass right back out. The next day, my friend and I was talking with, I had told him what was going on, and he called the cops. 2 officers showed up, and one stayed with me, and the other went with the other officer. The officer that stayed with me asked if I knew why he was there. I told him yes. He stated that I needed to go and get a rape kit completed. He also told me not to answer the phone call from my husband. I went to the hospital and had the rape kit completed and was told the police department would get the results to go with their investigation. I went back home and was immediately met with, "Where have you been?" I told him I went to the hospital and had to have a rape kit completed because I remember telling him twice that morning to stop because he didn't. It was considered spousal rape. I never even knew that was a thing. That's when he decided he was going to pack up and go back down to Arkansas with a brief stay in Missouri. I eventually went to the police station to find out the results of my rape kit when they said that if he would have stayed in Wisconsin, he would have been charged with first-degree sexual assault, spousal rape. But because he left the state and moved back south, and I said just leave it at that, there were never any charges pressed. I know, stupid on my behalf. I'm just glad that I held my ground and didn't beg him to stay. The physical, emotional, and mental abuse he put my 7 to 9-year-old through and the mental, emotional, and sexual abuse I had endured I would never wish on my worst enemy. My friend, I had started a long-distance relationship, as he lived in South Dakota at the time. We started a relationship. It lasted for 14 months. We had our ups and downs. It eventually got to the point where he had a screen tracker on my phone, so he knew every time I was on the phone and who I was talking to and what I was doing. He made my life unbearable. I had lost a lot of friends because of him. I lost my best friend, and I lost a lot of my guy friends because he thought I wanted to sleep with them all. The number of times when I heard, "I'm coming to get you and your son today, I'm going to be there to pick you up today," was at least 100 plus times throughout our relationship. It was to the point where I couldn't trust what came out of his mouth. The amount of control, along with the mental, emotional abuse I took from the relationship and the previous abuse with my estranged husband, I started having nightmares and very vivid ones. This is when I contacted Passages. The first individual I spoke with was Morgan. Oh, she was so reassuring and sweet. If it wasn't for me calling and speaking with Morgan, I would have never gotten into Passages. The first couple of nights there were rough. I would wake up with nightmares of both of my exes finding me and breaking in and continuing the horrendous cycle of sexual, mental, and emotional abuse. I was finally able to open up to one of the workers, Ashley. She helped me recognize that what I was dealing with my boyfriend at the time was his power and control over me. It was the coercion and threats to the point where he would threaten my life, intimidation where he actually pulled one of his guns out and put it to my head and said if I ever hurt him again, he would call me and pull the trigger and have me watch him bleed out. Male privilege, saying that he's the man of the house even though we never lived together. Economic abuse to where he got me fired from a job and he would always ask me for money. But when I would ask for money, he would tell me no and that I didn't deserve it. Threatening the livelihood of my son, telling me he would take my son away from me because I was living in a homeless shelter. He would isolate me from my friends because he convinced me they were brainwashing me, the minimizing and denying, blaming me for everything. Even if it wasn't my fault or my doing, and the emotional abuse he put me through, saying I was going to be nothing without him and that everyone else just wanted me for sex and nothing else. Oh man, if it wasn't for that day back in October of 2025, and if Ashley didn't take the time to sit down and talk with me and make me realize that domestic abuse comes in all shapes and forms, I honestly would probably still be with that guy. But thanks to Ashley, I was able to finally break the cycle. My son and I finally got into Ada James with the help of local housing authority and the workers from Passages and Ada James. If it would not have been for housing and the workers from both places, I honestly can say I don't know where my son and I would be today. Since being there, the apartment manager, Kayla, and I have had some very good conversations. Kayla has even made me realize I've come so far from where I was back in September and October, while I was at Passages and when I first got to Ada James. I've become completely independent. I have a solid roof over my sons and my heads. I have food on the table every night and clean clothes on my sons and my back. That having someone in my life should not be a job, but a luxury. Having a significant other should be an addition of happiness and love, not of work, headaches, and stress. If anyone, male or female, is going through an abusive situation, no matter how minor you or someone else thinks it is, do yourself a favor and reach out to Passages or your local domestic abuse shelter. Start there, but please get help for yourself and or any kids that are in the home, because it's too late if someone because a statistic of domestic abuse. No one, and I mean no one, needs to go through domestic abuse by themselves. If there is anything that anyone takes from my story, I would surely hope it would be of knowing that you are not alone. There have been people that have lived in your story in the past, and there's help out there for you. And please stop telling yourself, it's okay, my significant other will change, because you are allowing the door to stay open for additional abuse. Regardless if it's physical, emotional, mental, or sexual abuse, it is still categorized as domestic abuse. Do yourself a favor and break the cycle while you still can. I want to say thank you to Audrey and the Passages and Ada James staff for allowing me the privilege to share my story with you today.
Thank you, Audrey. Rose's story. Shannon, I'm guessing this story is typical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the cycle of abuse and, people reaching out to Passages. One of the most common things we hear is, I should have left a long time ago. I should have done this. I should have done that. And it's a normal response, but what we need to remember is when you're in a situation, you don't have the luxury of looking from the outside in. Friends and family are going to see the abuse. They're going to see the isolation. They're going to see all of those things way before the victim does. The victim's in it. And so I think it's really important when you know somebody or you witness any kind of power and control, that you understand that that person may not see it yet. And so by you pushing and pushing and pushing for them to leave that situation, it actually isolates them more because they don't want to let you down as their support system. And so if they don't have any intention of leaving because they don't see the abuse yet, basically you're pushing yourself further away as a support system. And so one of the things that I would suggest is education. We have this great thing called the Power and Control Wheel, and it is a visual, I believe it's on our website. It's a visual representation of all the different ways that all the tactics abusers use on their victims. And it's, it breaks it down. Abuse isn't all physical. You could be mentally abused, you could be verbally abused, you could be financially abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused. There's so many different forms of abuse. And I really want people to recognize that just because you haven't been hit doesn't mean you're not getting abused. Gaslighting, somebody who's constantly putting you down, but supposedly they love you. Those are just little things to recognize. And I encourage people to go to our website at www.passagesrc.com. There's a lot of really good information on there about domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, that will hopefully help people see whether or not they're in an abusive relationship, and that power and control wheel, which is the best visual I could recommend to anybody as far as trying to figure out if they're in an abusive relationship.
We have more from Passages coming up next hour, and in fact, it's our radiothon. So if you'd like to give us a pledge, give us a holler at 608-647-2111. Thanks to Audrey and Shannon for being our guests, and they'll be back with us a little bit later on. Next hour, also Nate, another outreach advocate, will join us, and we have some other features coming up during our Day for Passages. We're back with the Passages Radiothon today, and we'll be hearing more stories and more about the benefits of Passages, having them in our community. Henry Bray is in the studio.
How you doing, Phil?
Good, Henry. We need to get that phone ringing.
We need to get the phone ring. I'll tell you what. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to match $100. So,
woo! So
if someone wants to call and give $100, I'm going to match it.
Wow, we're getting Henry Bray's moldy money's coming out.
Well, it's your wallet, so
no, really. That's why a moth just flew out of it there. Yeah, okay.
So you have till 10:30 to match that.
All right.
So what time is it? 10:08.
Yeah, something like that.
10:08. So you have 22 minutes to match that $100. All right, let's get those phones ringing. They have the money goes for. I know they have some fence projects coming up. They have some. And it's for the victims that come in, necessities and stuff like that, which these people need those because they have nothing. So help WRCO, help Passages to help those people in need for our own community. So it stays local. Deodorant, bar soap, towels, anything that these people need, Passages come up with it, and it's all Passages is run on all donations. Am I wrong, Nate? Is that correct?
Completely funded by donations and grants. We got fence project coming up, concrete project coming up at the shelter. It goes like you said for clothes, hygiene needs, baby supplies.
Right. So get those phones ringing, help Passages out, because you never know who the next person is going to be that needs help. It could be me, could be you, could be anybody.
608-647-2111.
Get those phones ringing. You got 21 minutes to match my $100. $21.
Right. Thank you, Henry, for stepping up.
You bet.
You bet. Henry Bray joining us here on WRCO for our Day for Passages Radiothon. And, Nate is here, an outreach advocate. Nate, tell us a little bit why you're involved with this.
Well, I actually about eight and a half years ago had a situation in my own life that a couple advocates from Passages stepped in, helped me out a lot. I was going to court, dealing with some issues, and two advocates came in and really helped explain everything that was going on more than anyone else was explaining it to me. Made sense of everything, helped me fill out tons of paperwork, sat in court with me every time I was there. They called me, messaged me, came talked to me in person just to make sure that like emotionally I was doing good. Helped me through the whole thing. At the time I was working at group homes, and going through this with them, it just kind of felt this is the path, that I want to go on for a career. Fast forward 8 years, and found an ad saying they were looking for an advocate. So I applied, started emailing them, calling them, got my interview, got hired, was super excited, and it was kind of a full circle moment there.
Definitely, and you being a male, you want to emphasize the fact that it's not about female victims,
right?
Is it?
It's everybody, and even males can be victims of physical abuse or any type of abuse in a relationship. And Passages, we support survivors of all genders, provide shelter services, advocacy, safety planning, community resources for men and women who are going through domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, stalking. And male survivors also deserve to be heard, believed, supported. And as advocates, we're here to work with them confidentially and respectfully every step of the way. No one should have to face abuse alone. Now, when we think about sexual assault or domestic violence, most people automatically picture women as the victim. And while women absolutely experience high rates of violence, men are also survivors, and they often, they suffer in silence. Men are statistically less likely to report sexual assault or domestic violence compared to women, so the real numbers of male victims are probably a lot higher than we think. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to make it seem that women are abusive, but there's this myth that men can't be abused by or the victims of women, and it's just not true. In fact, this false idea is why most men who are victims feel embarrassment or shame, which stops them from coming forward and getting any form of help that they need. So I just want to take a minute to share some numbers. Approximately 48% of male victims of unwanted sexual contact don't report it. Nationally, nearly a quarter of men reported some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. Approximately 1 in 10 men in the U.S. experience contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime and reported some form of intimate partner violence-related impact. Nearly 1 in 4 men in the U.S. experience some form of contact sexual violence. About 1 in 17 men in the U.S. were victims of stalking at some point in their life. 46% of male victims reported being stalked by only female perpetrators, and a huge amount, 97% of men who experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner had only female perpetrators. So the question really is, why don't more men report? Men don't report for a lot of reasons. There's social stigma. Many men grow up hearing messages like, men should be strong, real men can defend themselves, men can't be victims. These beliefs can create a lot of shame in a guy. Then there's fear of not being believed. Some survivors that are male report being laughed at or dismissed when they do speak up, especially if the abuser was a female. Then confusion about what happened or masculinity expectations. Men often feel like asking for help is a sign of weakness, even though it takes a lot of strength to ask for help. Another big part of it is substance use. Many male survivors turn to alcohol or drugs as a coping mechanism. Because trauma lives in the body, it can show up in different ways. It can show up as anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, irritability, emotional numbness, chronic stress. And alcohol can temporarily numb these feelings. Drugs can temporarily quiet bad thoughts, but over time, substance use usually makes any symptoms worse. Survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence are significantly more likely to struggle with substance use disorders. For some men, drinking feels more socially acceptable than saying I'm hurting or I'm afraid or I need help. And not all trauma looks emotional. Some guys express trauma through anger or risk-taking behaviors, workaholism, isolation, physical symptoms like headaches, stomach issues. Others may seem just fine, but trauma doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like silence, and silence can be a really heavy thing for somebody to have to carry.
We think of substance abuse for somebody who is the abuser, and I guess I hadn't thought about it for somebody that is the victim trying to cope with it.
Right, trying to not have the intrusive thoughts, not have the flashbacks, the bad dreams, the negative self-thoughts. It's a way of coping with that and canceling all of that out for a moment at least, not having to deal with it.
That was the case with the story that was read last hour, the Rose survivor story. There was some substance abuse, I think, and things like that.
Yep.
The other thing that came to mind when Audrey read that was, the phones come into play. And I'm hearing that story, I'm like, why didn't she just throw the phone away and change her number? But I guess
Probably
that's easier.
would have made it worse because phones can be used as a giant form of control.
Yeah.
That's a way to keep track of where you're at, who you're talking to, how you're talking to them, if you're talking about your abuser, at all times.
Yeah, because you can be tracked a lot easier than you could in the old days, right?
Everybody's low-jacked when you got a phone on you.
Yeah, right, so much. Shannon, anything you want to add? You've heard some of the comments from Nate here this morning.
Yeah, I think Nate did an excellent job of, kind of giving some of the definitions of male abuse. I think it is something that our society, I think we're slowly adapting and we're slowly growing into understanding that there are a lot more men being abused, whether that's physically, sexually, mentally, financially, all the same ways as women. And we got to get rid of that stereotype, and we got to stop telling our boys, you're acting like a girl, stop crying, toughen up, all of those things, because emotions are absolutely normal. And if we don't, once again, it falls back to the youth. If we don't talk to our youth, and especially our young boys, and tell them that it's okay to have emotions, then when they grow up and they're adults and something happens to them, they're not going to be able to express how they feel, which means they are going to go down that route of self-coping. And, some of those could be, like Nate said, becoming a workaholic, and you just throw yourself into your work. You're working 70 hours a week just to not have to stop and think. Or you get into the substance abuse. There's also, those cases where people are abused as kids. Men are abused, men are abused as little boys, and then grow up, and their way of gaining their control back is to be an abuser themselves and take that power and control from anybody that they can, or their bullies in school. To me, that's a red flag. If I hear, about a male bully in school, my initial thought is, has something happened to that child? What has happened to that child? Are they seeing a male adult doing this behavior? Has this been done to them? Those are the things that I want people to be thinking about, especially with men and boys, is, there's this thought of, well, men can't be sexually assaulted unless they're willing. Well, without being graphic, your mind and your body are two separate entities. Your mind may be thinking, I don't want this to happen, but your body has natural sensations. Your body is going to do what it's supposed to do. And so a man can absolutely be sexually assaulted by a woman. And if you or anyone has had that happen to you, just know that Passages believes you. We absolutely believe you. We have been very fortunate to have more men come forward and ask us for help, especially in the last couple of years. It's been phenomenal. We're still just double digit, but the fact that more men are coming forward and asking for that help really gives me a lot of hope for the future, because we should be helping everybody. And, it does take, like Nate said, an awful lot of courage and strength to come forward as a male in our society when they're taught, you got to be strong and toughen up and all of these things. So, I think Nate hit that spot on.
Anything else you want to add this morning, Nate?
Yeah, just off of some of the things that Shannon said there, one of the most toxic phrases I can think of, and I'm guilty in my past of saying it also, but I think it leads boys and men later in life into holding everything inside and being silent, is the phrase man up. Telling somebody to just man up is saying just deal with it, it doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, then they're going to feel like they don't matter.
Well
so it's just a really toxic phrase.
Appreciate you coming in this morning, Nate.
Thank you.
Thanks for what you do. Outreach advocate Nate joining us here on WRCO. It's our day for Passages. Again, 647-2111 is the number to be a part of it. Pledge, we would really appreciate that. Any amount today would really help us out here on the messages, the message that Passages is putting out here today and their mission for the next year. Audrey will be back and we'll talk a little bit more about some things going on in relation to substance abuse, coping mechanisms, and the vicious cycle that it is on the morning show as it continues here until noon today from WRCO.
WRCO Studios, brought to you by the Richland Family Restaurant, serving up great tunes and tasty moments right here in Richland Center.
Welcome back to our day as we focus on passages. We're hoping that we can get some folks to help us out today, 608-647-2111, if you'd like to help out. And Shannon Roberts, also, somebody wants to give of their time, as you mentioned earlier. You look for volunteers and ideas, right?
Absolutely. So we have a multitude of volunteer opportunities, and we have a list on our website. So once again, www.passagesrc.com. There's a tab, Want to Help. Click on that. There's a volunteer application and a list of opportunities. And, if you have an idea, maybe you're a crocheter and, that has helped you cope with things, you can absolutely reach out to us and maybe we start a crocheting club or we teach victims and survivors how to do different activities as a healthy coping skill.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. You're always up for those kind of things, right?
Absolutely.
Audrey is back in the studio with us. We wanted to touch on, and we talked a little bit about it with Nate, but substance abuse and coping mechanisms and whatnot. Audrey, I guess, and I believe this is Alcohol Awareness Month, if I'm not mistaken, as well. But unfortunately, it seems like alcohol and drugs are sometimes a common factor, aren't they?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this just a little bit with the work that we do. Some of our residents that come into shelter have in the past struggled with substance abuse, or they are currently struggling when they come into shelter. So the one thing that I feel like a lot of people think is that the reason why these victims get taken advantage of is because they use drugs or, drink alcohol, and that's the reason why they should be blamed for what happened to them, which is completely false. Often, a lot of the trauma stems from early on, like childhood, and, there's not a lot of resources for them, in rural areas like this to actually cope, or they just don't learn the healthy coping mechanisms. They automatically go to the unhealthy ones. A lot of them grew up with a lot of trauma, and then later on they become victims themselves. So they start to use drugs and alcohol to cope with their trauma. It's just a coping mechanism to numb the trauma and those intrusive memories that they deal with every day. And many will develop PTSD, which is very strongly linked to substance use. And it can further victimization, like repeated assault or exploitation, but it doesn't make what happened to them their fault. It's because they didn't have the resources for healthy coping mechanisms. And people with histories of childhood sexual abuse report extremely high rates of substance abuse later in life, with some studies showing up to 60% of having substance use histories. So I feel like that's a very, very high rate, and it's very common in these areas. That is the most common thing that we see with any of our residents. So it's very important that we have those resources to give them when they come in, whether that's, like support groups or just getting them specific resources that are linked to substance abuse.
And it's easy as an outsider looking at a situation like that, thinking, okay, your parent or parents, abused substances or alcohol and abused you. Why are you going down the same path? It's easy for me to sit here and say that, but it is cyclical, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like that is a common thing that a lot of people will think about. A lot of people may not understand the cycle, which I will explain later on, of kind of why, people, maybe their mom or dad had substance abuse issues, so they're like, oh, like that must be the way to cope with, trauma. So throughout their lifetime, when they endure all this fear and shame and guilt, their only way of knowing like what to do with this trauma is to turn to those unhealthy coping mechanisms, and they don't want to ask for help with that trauma.
Does Passages work with other entities like, if somebody has got a drug or alcohol problem, you kind of direct them in a direction where they can get some help and maybe some counseling and those kind of things?
Yeah, so if there's not any resources locally, we try to kind of look anywhere nearby to see if there are resources out there that we can give our residents. If there's not, then we are also able to transport them to nearby places as well, just because, we may not have the services for them. So we want to make sure that they are getting the resources that they need, in order to take that next step and empower them to do better and empower them to be independent. And I think that's very important as an advocate, to be able to help them, whether it's at Passages or a different location, just getting them to where they need to go.
Shame and guilt are a couple of words that these people are going through many times, right?
Yeah. I feel like that's, I want to say, two of the most common things that a lot of people will feel is they feel like guilt because they feel like it's their fault, or, it's their fault that this happened to them. What could they have done differently so that they could have prevented this from happening, or like what's wrong with them? Why does it always keep happening to them? Like those kinds of feelings that they think about on a daily basis because they just don't know like where to turn to. So Passages, I feel like, is very good at helping them kind of redirect and empower them to, not feel those types of things and know that they have a support system to actually help, get them to the next step in their life.
Nate is back with us as well. Nate, I think you wanted to touch on some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms that we've talked about with Audrey.
Yeah. When people think of unhealthy coping mechanisms, most probably think of like alcohol, substance use, which those are unhealthy, but there's several others that go over people's minds. Self-harm behaviors, cutting, burning, other forms of physical harm to release the emotional pain that people are feeling. Disordered eating patterns like restriction, binging, purging, overworking, or constant busyness to avoid thinking about the trauma, just trying to keep your mind on something else constantly. Compulsive behaviors like shopping, gambling, gaming, internet use to just keep yourself distracted from all the thoughts and the distress. Perfectionism, or an intense need for control over tiny little aspects of life because they didn't have control over the other things that happened to them. These are all unhealthy coping mechanisms that I think a lot of people look at as just quirks, or that's just someone's, personality trait, and usually there's something deeper behind that.
Isn't it interesting, though? We talk about addictions to other things such as gambling,
right,
and it could be tied into something of this nature. Could be.
Yeah, it's not usually just something that's spurred on because, I played cards with some buddies and it was fun. I won $10, and that turns into a huge problem. It stems from something else generally.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and that's interesting. And then I hadn't thought either about eating disorders and those kind of things.
That's a big one. I mean, not just like you see people in high school and you'll see a girl with cuts, but then you don't notice the skinny girl or the one that maybe is a little overweight, and you don't think, like, why they're that way. You just think, oh, she's anorexic, or she eats too much, and that's not usually the case either.
tied to something else oftentimes, I'm sure. Shannon, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so with the eating disorders, one of our first instincts would maybe go to anorexia or something like that, and deep trauma can manifest that way. What I've seen in my work as a sexual assault advocate is, especially young teenage girls, they will put on an enormous amount of weight. They actually go the opposite. And what they're doing is they're basically putting on a protective armor. And they think that if I'm overweight, then I won't be attractive. And then I won't have to worry about being sexually assaulted, because it's the skinny, pretty girls that are sexually assaulted. And so, a lot of the morbidly obese people, we've seen them on TV, the 600-pound woman or man or whatever. If you listen to their story, I bet you 95% of them have had sexual assault in their life. And it becomes a really unhealthy coping skill. The other one I just want to touch on too real quick, because it was something that I actually used that as a coping skill as a survivor myself, that people just kind of don't think about it as a coping skill. But I was a hardcore cleaner. So my home would be spotless. Like, to the point that, the light switches were wiped off every day, and, just pulling the refrigerator out weekly and cleaning behind it. It was an obsession. It became an obsession. It became a compulsion. And that was my way at the time of having control. And so by having this perfectly clean house, that was my way of having my power and control over something in an abusive relationship, because I lived with my abuser. And so at that time, that was the thing, which it's confusing, right? Because cleaning, there's no harm in cleaning.
I was going to say, there's worse things that you could do.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's not drug use. It's not alcohol use. It's not a impairment. Cleaning, I mean, who doesn't like a clean house? That could be a very positive coping skill, right? And we actually use that as a positive coping skill, because when you clean, it takes energy. So you're releasing that pressure that you have built up in you of frustration, anger, hurt, whatever that emotion is. You're releasing that physically. But then once you're done, you have the result. You have the good end result. But like everything, it can become a compulsion. And with me, it became a compulsion to where it became a very unhealthy coping skill, because when my kids were small, as soon as they had a toy on the floor, I was picking it up and putting it away. And it took a little bit for me to realize that's what I was doing. So I just want to touch on that for a minute, because there are some coping skills that are actually very healthy, but you have to be careful that it doesn't become a compulsion.
So what did you do, Shannon, to kind of get over that?
I spread myself out a little bit more. So instead of just focusing on cleaning, I would read more. I would find other activities to do to fill that time. And maybe somebody to exert that energy would get into kickboxing or something like that. My kids were small. We went on a lot of walks. And that was my way of expelling that energy without obsessively cleaning. It actually took me out of the house to where I couldn't be in there cleaning. And I got to spend more time with my kids. And that was one thing that I wasn't doing, because I was so hyper-focused on that coping skill of having that clean house. And I think a lot of people in abusive relationships do go that route, because, maybe my partner won't be abusive to me if I keep the house clean. If I make sure supper's on the table every day, then they won't be abusive to me. And it just ends up being, as Audrey's going to talk about, a vicious cycle. It's just a vicious cycle. So I used other things. I started going outside more, started, going for more walks, reading, things like that, to kind of spread that time out so I couldn't hyper-focus on it.
We'll talk more a little bit about that, the coping cycles and some of the other things and some numbers during our Day for Passages after the timeout. Straight ahead here, more about it, and we'd love to hear from you. 608-647-2111, your monetary donation, maybe donating some time, whatever it would be. We'd love to hear from you. The operators are standing by, some of the volunteers representing Passages and Ada James, and we'll be back with more on our morning show get-together, which again extends until noon today.
Welcome to Richland Family Restaurant Studios, your spot for great music and even better vibes.
We're in the studio today with guests and friends from Passages, volunteers from the community, and Henry Bray, who's here.
How you doing, buddy?
How did the response go to your challenge today?
I got it matched. They said they want to match Phil.
They want to match Phil.
Yeah.
I bid $100.
Did you? Do you want to match it? Put a match on it?
I just did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. So there you go.
So, all right. So now we're looking for another $100 where you can have to match it.
That I have to?
Yeah. Is that no or no?
Well...
Oh, you already did, Matt. You already threw your... Okay.
I already did.
Okay.
I was going to say, you might have to turn me upside down, hold me by the ankles, and shake some change out of
Well, we probably won't get any change. Probably just lint.
Could be.
Just lint.
We want to throw it out there, though, and this has been something that somebody asked me the other day. Hey, you're going to do another guest DJ night on those days?
Yes.
And we're going to throw it out there this morning from now until just before noon.
Right.
If you'd like to be a guest DJ, we've had some really good ones lately.
Yes, we have.
For good causes. So if you'd like to call and bid, the top bidder will get that, and they'll donate the money to Passages. And call and talk to Courtney.
Ask for Courtney if you call. It's 647-2111. Ask for Courtney and to have them bid on Those Were the Days. An hour of programming. It's actually kind of fun for you.
It's a lot of fun.
And for them.
Yeah, you got to pick something from the 50s through the 90s.
Yep.
It's not hard to do.
No.
But that's the only stipulation. You can't come on and, sing for an hour like you couldn't.
Yeah, I couldn't do it.
No,
I can't sing for it.
We wouldn't want that.
But no, seriously, now's a good time to call. We've had a lot of people interested in bidding for an hour for Those Were the Days. So now's the time to do it. It helps a great cause.
608-647-2111.
Yeah, and some of the great donations out there came in today. John Cosgrove, he called Brian Hill. He's called Darren Walsh from Walsh's. They've called just some great people stepping up to the plate. And I'm going to see if I can help anybody out. If you hear it, give us a call. It doesn't have to be $100. It could be $5. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
$5, $10, anything will help. I think last year I gave them my change bank, and they had it was like $23 in it or something like that. So.
And a couple of chiclets and
a couple of chiclets and I'm missing and a tooth. But I never got my tooth back. So
talk about digging deep.
You know what? Dig deep. It didn't have any gold in it, so they gave me it back. So, but anyway, yeah, call in. It's for Passages. Great cause. Mm-hmm. And there's great people here. I've got to meet some new people today, and great people. I mean, they do great things, and you know what? Sometimes it's in a tough situation that they have to do their job. So I admire these people for what they do, because I probably wouldn't want to do that.
Exactly. We wouldn't be capable of it.
No,
thanks,
not at
Hank.
all. Yeah, thanks,
Keep
buddy.
us posted on what's going on the front office there. And,
for what I'm doing personally, or just
no?
Oh, okay, Passages.
Like the good things that are going on behind the scenes.
Okay.
So again, you can bid at 647-2111. You can also bid on an hour of Those Were the Days. That's kind of an auction deal, and the top bid gets it, and the money that you give will go directly to Passages. An hour of Those Were the Days during a future program. Audrey, we want to come back to you now as we get back to things. The next topic that we want to talk about. What would you like to say?
I guess before I talk about the cycle, I just wanted to add that psychology is fascinating because it explains why behind human behavior and emotions, why we do the things that we do. It helps us understand ourselves and others. So some things I'll never understand, but I have some examples of how the cycle works and the depth that it goes. So my first example basically would be you grow up watching your dad abuse your mom verbally, physically, emotionally, in any sort of way. Sometimes the daughters will attract other abusive men because like that's what they're used to seeing. That's how they think that they're supposed to be treated. They grew up seeing their mom being treated that way, which doesn't make sense, right? Because, but sometimes sons, if they see their dad or stepdad or maybe like a boyfriend abuse their moms, they will try to venture and say, I'm not going to do what happened to my mom, or they become perpetrators themselves because they're used to seeing men treat women that way. So they think that that's how women should be treated because that's how they, grew up. That's how they were wired from the trauma. But because of the cycle, this population is very vulnerable. They have, low self-esteem. So these types of men who are perpetrators will seek out vulnerable women who typically, have trauma in the past. They'll take advantage of them so that they can abuse them. It's just, I don't know how to word that, but they see it as like an opportunity, basically. I will say there are so many other types of like sexual abuse. One I feel like that is not talked about enough is COCSA, which is child-on-child sexual abuse. So a lot of children will develop trauma when they're growing up, and sometimes children can be abused from someone else in their home, and they think that it's okay to do it to another child. So when another child endures trauma, whether it's a cousin, sibling, family friend, they think that that's okay to do to other children because it's a imbalance of power where they want to take control of the situation themselves or, sexually abuse another child. In some senses, children who have been sexually abused don't want to do that because they are, traumatized. Another thing that I recently learned was intergenerational transmission trauma. It's abuse that perpetrates a cycle where like survivors as adults may repeat abusive patterns or they'll go into abusive relationships, and it's often with partners who echo the behavior of their childhood abusers. So if your father is, like verbally or mentally abusive towards your mom, you might end up with a man who verbally and mentally abuses you later on, which I'm still trying to understand why that happens. But another thing with it, stemming so early on in life, there's trauma responses. So unhealed trauma often manifests like chronic shame, anxiety, people pleasing. Those are also the types of people that perpetrators will somehow attract because they know that these victims are going to people please them, do as they ask, those kinds of things. But to be able to break the cycle, you have to be able to identify these patterns because you start to see similar traits that your mom or dad had, when they abused your parent, or you start to recognize the pattern or feel some familiar types of patterns, and then they start by changing behavior or consider therapy once they start to identify these patterns that are happening in a relationship that are not so healthy.
Shannon, if you have a child or grandchild, let's say that you know that they've been abused, how do you kind of cut it off at the pass? I mean, what are some things as a parent or grandparent or a caregiver you can do?
So I think the biggest thing is having positive support systems. So I'll give a personal example. So I was raised in an abusive home. My father was very abusive as when I was a child. He was an alcoholic. And he was also abusive to my mother. And when I became an adult and had my first child, my immediate reaction was, I will never do to my children what has been done to me. Okay, so myself and my older brother were able to stop that cycle of abuse. Neither one of us have fallen into alcoholism. because we made conscious decisions that we are not going to do that. However, with that being said, I did fall into victimization with domestic violence, multiple relationships, one after the other, because, like Audrey stated, as a little girl, I watched how my father treated my mother. And based on that, as a female, as a woman, I felt like that was how I deserved to be treated, because that was how my mother was treated. And my mother is, high on, my pedestal, the pedestal. I looked up to her. And so, unfortunately, I did fall into that cycle of being with abusive partners based on what I saw. So the cycle is very interesting. And as Audrey said, the psychology behind it is super interesting as well. Once I got further into adulthood, I realized that I have way more power and control than I thought I did. And I don't deserve to be treated that way. And I'm not going to allow anybody to treat me that way. And fortunately, I was able to break that cycle. And fortunately, my children did not follow down that path, and that cycle has been broken for our family. But, for young kids who are watching this happen, to have a support system, maybe that's a grandparent, maybe that's, a teacher at school, a guidance counselor, anybody showing them respect, how healthy relationships look. And that's why it's really important our outreach advocates are able to get into the schools, get into the daycare programs, the summer programs, and talk to the kids or train staff on how to model those behaviors. Because when kids are shown how to respect other people, they learn respect themselves. They learn how to respect who they are and what should and shouldn't happen as far as what a healthy relationship looks like versus an unhealthy relationship. When we were kids, and you're maybe a little older than me, but when we were kids, when you're out at the playground and some little girl comes up and hits you, it's because she liked you.
That's
right?
what they always said.
That's what they always said. Oh, she really likes you.
I never got hit, by the way.
Okay. That's fair. But that's not how it should be.
Right.
But why is that? And if you really start thinking about it, that's because back in the day that was normal.
Yeah. But here's a question for you or for Audrey too. It's always been said that, well, some young women like the bad guys, the bad guy image, and they're not all abusers, obviously, but some could be. I mean, why is that?
I honestly have never figured this out. From personal experiences, I have a very bad picker, I would say. I will say, since my last relationship, I feel like finding those red flags early on is helpful to not maybe pick those bad guys. But for a while, I don't know what it was, whether it was high school, that was the thing to do, was to these bad guys who would do these crazy things for you out of what they would call love, which now being 22, I'm that's insane. Why would I have thought that? And I don't know if it's the social aspect of it, of that's what most girls want. I still to this day don't understand why that's a thing necessarily, but
Shannon?
My thought process on it, just from personal experience as well, going after the bad boys, is when you consider yourself vulnerable, those bad boys look like protection. Okay, so if I were to go, and this was, my mindset back in the day, if I were to go and seek out a man who, let's go stereotype here, suit and tie, good business career, that sort of thing, versus a man in leather on a bike and, has earrings and tattoos, As a vulnerable woman, I'm going to feel safer with that leather dude because he represents strength and all of that. And this is stereotype. I'm not about stereotyping. It's just to make the story. But I would prefer that bad boy because there is strength. He looks like strength. He looks like protection. Versus the guy in the suit who, has that business career. I may not feel like I'm going to be physically protected, which in all reality, that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
But I'm saying I believe that's why a lot of vulnerable women look for those bad boys. It's that sense of security and that sense of protection.